Hi, this is Tony with a little presentation that I call sort of tongue-in-cheek, how to read like a grad student. For the course that you're taking right now and other places in your doctoral journey, you'll be asked to read a book. Read one this week, perhaps read one every week for some time to come. And you may have encountered this in previous educational ventures as well. And some students are like, "How do I do that? Books take a while. There are hundreds of pages, and it takes a while to work through them." And so one of the reasons for this is to relieve that burden from you a little bit and relieve your mind about what that involves in a scholarly level. When you're an undergrad, you're reading for a little different purpose. You're reading largely for content. There's a lot you need to learn. And you're welcome to do that, of course, at the doctoral level. But here we're reading primarily for thesis and argument. And what we find is that a typical book, this doesn't apply across the board, unfortunately, but a typical book I would say is 90% illustration and only 10% thesis and argument. So the trick is to figure out how to read in a way that allows you to see the skeleton and not have to worry about the flesh, unless you want to, or if you need to. If you get a thesis and argument that are not quite making sense and you need to go in a little bit further and a little bit more deeply, that would make sense. Now, again, this doesn't apply across the board, but most books probably can be captured in 60 minutes or 90 at the most if you can explore what it is that they're saying in terms of thesis and argument. And that's what we're primarily looking for at the doctoral level. You will not remember all the illustrations. You will not remember the 90% 6 months on, but you may remember that there's this book on my shelf or in my Kindle or something that made this argument, that's arguing this point, and that's what scholars do. And then if you need more, you can pull out the book and look it up and see that a little bit. So how do you do that? How do you go about this process? Well, one of the first things that we want to do is recognize that we see from where we stand, all of us. We have a particular context, and that's how we see the world. And part of what doctoral learning is to do is to give us other places to stand, but also colleagues who stand in those other places more naturally than we do, and or conversation partners, and be able to see how they're looking through their eyes. So one of the first things we'd want to do is find out who this author is or the authors are. Where do they stand? Is there a bio on them and attached to the book? Is there something that will tell you where they're located geographically, where they situate themselves culturally or theologically? Um, what is their, if they're an academic, what is their discipline? One of the primary texts that we use in, for instance, one of the disciplines that I teach, leadership studies, was written by somebody who was not originally a leadership scholar. He was a communication scholar, and therefore, he was able to step outside of the discipline a little bit and be able to look at the various models and theories that were developed to explain effective leadership without having necessarily a personal investment in one of them, like most leadership scholars did. His unique place of standing allowed him to see more objectively and therefore be able to write a book that most leadership scholars now use, because it is a good coverage of the different competing models. And there are many, and they're confusing, and most of us are invested a little bit too much to provide that objectivity. So that's an example of this. Where do they stand? If they're inside the system or inside a discipline, then they might be arguing for a particular viewpoint. And it'd be lovely to find out what that is. So you may not be able to construe all of that from a biography in the back of a book. It may not hurt, however, to take 5 minutes and Google them or look them up on Wikipedia if they have a place or something to get a sense of who this person is and where they're likely to be coming from. Don't pigeonhole them too much. Let them speak for themselves. But again, we see from where we stand is a really good principle here. So where do they stand? And of course, it's helpful sometimes to read the blurbs and the covers. A lot of that is marketing, of course, but at least it'll give you some sense of where they're starting from, who's recommending this, who's doing the forward. The heart of it, however, should be in an introduction. And that's where a well written book, an author will say, "This is what I'm here for. This is what it's about." They will state their thesis up front. They may not call it a thesis, so you have to learn how to read that. But what is it that they're arguing, and how do they plan to develop that argument? A good introduction will give a bit of a preview of where they're going to go with that. Now, that may be a standalone chapter, or may be a preface. It may be the beginning of a chapter one. They may lead you into a slowly. So you may have to go look for that introduction, but that's one that you would want to read very carefully. And then the next thing to do probably is to go to whatever passes for a conclusion, whether it's a separate chapter or the end of the last chapter or something. And there they should ideally review what it was that they said their thesis was going to be and what arguments that they've been making all along. And so you can see at the beginning and the end bookends that will give you an idea for the big picture of things. This is the thesis. This is what they're arguing. This is how they're going about it. Now, the content in between matters, but it matters more like the if you have a spine, it's the I'm not coming up with the word right now, the pieces of the spine that will connect the dots here a little bit. So we kind of repeat this pattern in chapter one. You would read the introduction and then read the conclusion. Okay, here's a part of the argument. Here's maybe setting the case, the rationale for the argument or something like that. I would look at the subtitles. I'd look at probably just glance through any figures or graphics that they would present and just get a sense if that's good enough to get what their argument is. A good chapter will have one good point, one good argument building toward the thesis. Now do the same thing with chapter two, with chapter three, with chapter four. If there are parts of a book, then part one is to be about this, and part two is about this. So I want to get that structure, but I don't have to read everything that's written. As I said, keep in mind, in a typical book, 90% of it will be what I'm calling illustration or amplification. It will restate and illustrate what it is that the author is trying to say in order to persuade you. If you're not persuaded, if it doesn't make sense, then you may need to spend a little more time in a particular chapter, a particular section to see what it is that is being said. At this point, by the way, it would perhaps be good if you turn off your evaluative senses a little bit. You're not here to argue. You're not here to necessarily, you just want to hear the author's voice and get what they're saying right now. There'll be a time for that later. And of course, as doctoral students, as scholars, we have to do that and we can't turn that off completely anyway. But put that aside for the moment. Let's hear what it is they have to say. Let's be fair and open and see what it is that is being argued here. And you do that throughout the chapters. And then hopefully what was said at the introduction and what was said at the conclusion will now make sense. Okay, the author said they were going to do it this way. I'm going to make this argument. I've seen how they developed that argument in the conclusion. They pull all the pieces together. I've seen how they've done that. I know where they stand, and therefore I have a sense of this work. And what I would encourage you to do then at that point is to stop immediately and write that down in no more than 2 sentences. And one way to do this is through the creation of an annotated bibliography of the works that you read. We will occasionally ask you to do a literature review, and this annotated bibliography would be kind of the short version of that, sort of a short reminder. Oh, that's what that book was about. That's what they were arguing. I have that there in 2 pages, 2 sentences, maybe 3 if you really need to, but something that would be fairly short and concise. And then if you do a literature review, you can have that work kind of engage in conversations with other ones that might be arguing for something the opposite or something similar or something parallel, and you can bring them into conversation with one another. And as I said, this is maybe not applicable to every single book. There are some that are just tomes and they're heavy and they're packed and they're good and they'll take a little more longer. Others that it's just pretty clear right up front. I mean, there's like a 15-minute read. You flip through it. Okay, I get it. I know what they're doing. Maybe those are the ones where you're already inclined toward their argument anyway, and it makes sense. So 60 minutes, 90 minutes is kind of an in-between kind of period of time, but the quality of learning is not measured necessarily by the amount of time invested, at least in a particular work. The quality of learning is measured by the conversation that occurs and what we end up doing with it. If a particular author provokes your thinking and you spend 60 or 90 minutes being having your imagination stretch, having questions entered that kind of circulate in your head or in your mind or in your spirit for some time to come, then then that has done its good work in you. That's what it's been there for. And if you keep it on a shelf or keep it accessible or know where it's at in the library, and if you need to go back to it for a fuller read or for fuller explanations at some point, then you can do that. But it's going back to a familiar well, and you know what water is, and you just want to be able to get a little bit more of it. So hopefully that's a help to you if you have not previously read this way or have not previously done doctoral studies, to be able to make this a little bit more manageable, but also make it more meaningful as you're doing the readings for this program. Blessings on you as you do it. Thanks.